Hello, my name is Olivia Dries, and I'm a student at Lourdes University. My studies are in middle childhood language arts and social studies, so hopefully one day I'll be a teacher teaching language arts or social studies. But today, I'll be talking to you about a leader who I find particularly inspiring. She is someone whose name you may not recognize, but I can almost guarantee that by the end of this, you'll be grateful for all of her efforts. She has definitely impacted your life in some way, shape, or form, and you don't even know it yet. And the person I'm speaking about is Margaret Sanger. She was the founder of Planned Parenthood, and she was a crusader for birth control usage, sexual safety, and just general human rights. Margaret Sanger went through a lot in order to get us where we are today with birth control, a lot more than you can even imagine. She was born and grew up in a time where birth control was not a thing. Women had very few options. They either had babies, lots of babies, or they didn't get married and didn't have babies, or if they got pregnant and didn't want a baby, or they'd had so many babies and they just couldn't bear another child, like they just financially, physically, emotionally could not bear another child, they had abortions. Now, abortions at this time were not legal. Abortions were not okay. They were something very hush-hush, and they weren't fun. Not that abortions are fun now, but medically speaking, the advancements have made abortions safer for women in general, and back then, there just wasn't that sort of medical ability. So women, if they wanted an abortion, could go and pay $5, which at the time was like $500, or maybe even more, and go and have someone give them an abortion, and it would still not be good for them. It would still be very painful. It would still be very hard on the body, but $5 was a lot of money, as I mentioned. So if women, wanted to have that abortion and couldn't afford it, then they had to find other means to abort the baby. And there were other means. But it was very harmful for the body. It caused a lot of pain for women, a lot of disease, sickness. Many women even died because of complications with these abortions. And Margaret Sanger saw that. Not only were the abortions really terrible and hard for women because they didn't have any other way of controlling how many children they had, but just for women to continuously have so many children was just hard for them, and women didn't really have a choice. They had to have the babies. That's what women did. They got married, they tended the house, they had babies, they took care of those children. It didn't matter if it was hard on the body. It didn't matter if it was hard on the woman in general. That's what she had to do. And Margaret was personally impacted by this. She grew up in a large family. There was 6 children at least, and her mother was very frail due to having so many children, and she ended up contracting tuberculosis, and Margaret helped care for her as she was dying. Her mother died when Margaret was 20, and Margaret cared for her as she died and ended up contracting tuberculosis herself because she was caring for her mother. So she was personally impacted by the fact that women didn't really have any means to not have children at the time. They just had to keep having them no matter what the cost. So Margaret decided that she would become a nurse. So her sisters helped her pay for college and she became a nurse. And she married William Sanger right out of nursing school. But she began nursing. William knew the woman Margaret was, and he was okay with her doing her job. She went to school. And he supported her, which you'll find out later that this was a big thing, to have his support. It mattered. So, anyways, Margaret, she began caring for women, specifically women who had abortions, who had just gotten sick or ill because of all the abortions they had, or how many children they had, just women who were sick and dying because they could not control their own reproductive abilities. They couldn't do anything to stop themselves from getting pregnant, and they suffered the consequences. And Margaret was very personally impacted by this. She saw that it was wrong that these women could not do anything about the situation they were in. This was just life, and nobody else shared Margaret's opinion. Or, let me rephrase that. They may have shared that opinion, they may have seen that what the women were going through was wrong. Women probably agreed, but it's hard to stand up to such a gigantic societal norm. But Margaret's father was a very forward-thinking man, and he instilled that in Margaret. And so she decided that this had to change. You know, women needed to know that there were options out there for them. Birth control was not legal, but there were ways for women to use some sort of contraception and understand better how their bodies work so that maybe they wouldn't have to have so many children, so maybe they wouldn't have to have abortions. You know, women needed to know that they had options. But one problem with this was in 1869, it's the same year Margaret was born, the Comstock laws were passed. The Comstock laws basically said that there couldn't be any information published or passed around that included birth control, reproduction, or anything of that sort. Like, that information was just considered disgusting and horrible, and it was just not allowed to be printed or discussed or passed around. Which, I mean, you can tell people all you want about a birth control method, but how many people can you really reach with word of mouth? So, Margaret saw the big picture here. Margaret was a leader, and she could see that there was a lot of flaws in this life, and she could see that it was going to be hard for her to conquer this, but it was necessary. She wanted to ensure that children felt loved and cared for. And imagine being a mother of 6 or 7 or 10 children and trying to care for them and love them and make them feel wanted when in actuality you'd had so many children and you couldn't economically handle it. Maybe you couldn't emotionally handle it. Maybe they weren't really being cared for because there were so many of them and you couldn't do anything about it because that was just life. And Margaret didn't want that for children. She wanted children to feel loved, as all children should be. And she wanted women to realize that they can control their fate, that their bodies are their bodies, and their destiny is entirely in their hands if they want it to be. So she began writing a column called The Woman Rebel in a socialist paper. And she was very careful to avoid talking about birth control because she knew that it was against the law. She was very conscious of that, and she stayed out away from birth control, but she did talk about puberty and what girls went through in puberty and reproductive health. Not necessarily sex, but just their reproductive systems and how they work, because that information just wasn't out there. It was just unknown. But the column was taken out of the paper, she was censored, and she was told that she couldn't be talking about those things. So she decided that she wasn't going to follow that rule. So she wrote her own paper. She started her own paper talking about birth control specifically. She stopped worrying about what people thought. She stopped caring about the laws. She realized that if she couldn't even talk about puberty and reproductive health, then what could women know about their own bodies? So she started her own paper, and she was very specifically talked about birth control. She broke the law knowingly, but she did it because she believed in herself. She believed it was the right thing to do. She knew this was an issue, and she wasn't going to let anyone stop her, even if that meant she was arrested, which she was. Margaret ended up getting arrested, and during the several weeks before her trial, when she was supposed to be preparing to defend herself, she instead wrote Family Limitation, which is a book entirely dedicated to birth control and options for women. And it ended up being very popular. It sold many, many copies, and it was sort of like the pocket guide to sexual safety. But it didn't do anything to help her stay out of jail. So she wrote this book and she fled the country. She fled to England, where the fight for birth control had already been won. Women could take birth control. They understood about family planning and sexual safety and how those things worked, and because it was legal there. It was like a safe haven for Margaret to have found this place where she could grow and learn and educate herself and not be put in jail. So she spent a lot of time in the museums. She spent a lot of time in the libraries. She became a sponge for sexual safety, and she sucked it all in. And she found some really amazing mentors while she was there. Havelock Ellis, who wrote Studies in the Psychology of Sex, was one of her mentors, and they became very close, and he mentored her on a lot of the things that she was wondering about, and she wanted to know more about sex and reproduction. And she also met Dr. Johann Rutgers, who was I don't believe the founder, but like the right-hand man of a Dutch abortion clinic, and she found out everything she needed to know about opening her own abortion clinic or birth control center without it being unsafe for women. You know, how it works, not just business-wise, but for safety, because it wasn't anything she could get experience with otherwise. So he taught her all there was to know about how to safely open up and run an abortion clinic. So, you know, opportunity and hardship were plentiful for Margaret. Margaret, as she was in England, found out that Comstock, who published those laws, had died, but also her husband had been arrested for giving people her book and giving people her papers and some of her work because he was supporting her, and he was arrested for that by distributing that information. And she also found out that her daughter died, which was very impactful for Margaret because part of this crusade was for her daughter. You know, she had fled the country, yes, but she did it in order to help bring about the changes she wanted. She wanted her daughter to be able to grow up and live in a world where she could take birth control and decide what she wanted to do with her life and her body without being sick or having painful, horrible abortions or dying. So, despite the fact that she was learning so much and getting so much from her experience in England, she found out that things at home weren't so good, but also that the opinions on birth control were beginning to shift. So at the beginning, in America, Margaret had very few friends, very few people supporting her, because what she was trying to achieve was very high up. It was a hard to achieve goal. And Margaret didn't think that she could do it. Or she knew she could do it, but it's hard to achieve something without support of others. You know, her husband was supportive and she had a few friends who were helping, but at the end of the day, she was almost very alone. But now that she had supporters in England and the ideas on birth control were starting to change because of information she was giving out or she had created, she decided it was time to come home. So she came home, and she wasn't going to let any of these challenges stop her. She wasn't going to let the fact that her husband was in jail stop her. She wasn't going to let her grief over her child stop her. She turned her challenges into opportunities, and she made the most of it. It inspired her even more to make this happen in honor of those things. So Margaret, she went on a tour across America to educate people on birth control. And everywhere she went, she met different women who wanted the same things she did, who wanted to help open up birth control clinics. The more that she explained her ideas to people, the more she found people who supported and believed the same things, who weren't afraid to speak out anymore. So one by one, city by city, she was changing the beliefs and thoughts of people, and those people wanted to make change too. They wanted to try and open their own clinics. They wanted to do what they could to help spread the message that Margaret was saying, that women have a right to their own bodies, that they should be able to take birth control, and that there's nothing wrong with that it is their human right. So that was incredibly successful for Margaret. And on October 16th, 1916, she opened up the very first birth control clinic in the United States, also known as Planned Parenthood. And Planned Parenthood was open for 10 days. She and 2 or 3 other friends ran it fairly successfully for those 10 days before it was shut down. And then she and those women spent 30 days in jail, And while Margaret was in jail, she, never let an opportunity go by. She educated the women in jail about birth control and contraceptive methods and just how their body works. So even in jail, she was finding new ways to show people what she believes and try and help them. Doesn't matter where you're at, there's always an opportunity. So Margaret opened up, after she got out of jail, the American Birth Control, she started the American Birth Control Conference, she started the American Birth Control League, and she opened the Birth Control Clinical Research Bureau, all within the years of 1921 and 1923. The American Birth Control Clinical Research Bureau legally gave out birth control to women to see how it medically impacted them. So essentially, women could take birth control, but it was under research. But any progress is good progress. And slowly but surely, the tides were turning step by step, day by day. Things were changing for Margaret. So there was a court case, the U.S. versus one package of Japanese pessaries. It made it legal for contraceptives to be imported into America. And in 1937, the American Medical Association declared that birth control was a valid form of medical treatment and that women should be able to take it and use it. In 1966, there was the Griswold versus Connecticut case that said that married couples could take birth control if they wanted to. It was perfectly legal. And in 1960, birth control was sold for the first time. Hormonal birth control was sold for the first time. So Margaret achieved what she wanted to achieve. She had a lot of resistance. There were groups of people who hated what she was doing, who did not believe in birth control and contraception, but she didn't let that stop her. The Nazi groups were burning her books on birth control. Catholics were angry about what she was saying and rejected her wholeheartedly, but she didn't care. It didn't matter because her belief was stronger than her challenges, She was condemned, she was hated, but she didn't stop. And she not only wanted birth control for, a certain group of people, she wanted birth control for everyone. People, especially poor people, people who lived in poverty, they didn't have access to birth control methods necessarily that were anything they could afford or that were safe for them, and she wanted to make sure that there were opportunities for them to have safe contraception too. Essentially, sexual safety was for everyone, and that's what she wanted to achieve, and she did. As a leader, she was flawed, she was not perfect, and you will never find her up there next to Mother Teresa, and that's because people aren't perfect, and that's okay. She was still a great leader. The flip side of being driven and having perseverance and such a strong belief in yourself is that you can almost be single-minded and obsessive and maybe even condescending to people because of how much you know and how much you're trying to get out of an experience with somebody. And it was detrimental to some of her relationships to be so obsessed with this goal of hers and to be so knowledgeable about it. It turned people away sometimes. She lost friends, she gained friends, but in the end, she wanted to achieve her goal, and that's what mattered most. She lived what she believed, and that's something that no one can take away from her, and that's something that I think everyone could take from this, is if you believe in something, you have to live it. Okay, you don't have to get arrested or flee the country or anything like that, but if you believe in something and you want something to change, then don't let anything stop you. Let Margaret Sanger inspire you too, and thank her for birth control because, You might have a lot more siblings without it. So maybe today you'll leave with a little more knowledge on somebody who you didn't know about, and just a little more passion for living. You know, we live in a time that it's difficult. It's difficult. There's so many issues, but live what you believe. And if you want change, be the change. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And I'll see you next time.